Simon, let's shift the topic a little bit to emerging markets now. But what do you think has potentially led to Africa's late development compared to the rest of the world's developing countries, if you agree with that?
Yeah, sure. I think Africa has obviously a troubled history in many ways. But what's interesting is sort of South Africa's place as well in the context of Africa. I mean, South Africa is the most industrialized country in Africa. It has a strong influence over the continent as well, from a leadership point of view. I think our transition to democracy has also been seen as a model for other countries in many ways, to aspire towards. I think also, South Africa's got a very diverse economy. It's got a very sophisticated financial system, and very good banking system. There's very good agriculture, very good mining sector, very strong tech and entrepreneurial sector in South Africa. There's a very strong spirit of entrepreneurship, I'd say, in South Africa. And I would say that South Africa's businesses, its large companies, have also gone into the rest of the continent to provide services. We said with various banks and tech companies. South Africa is also a large electricity provider for many Southern African countries. So it is kind of like viewed as a sort of continental leader, I could say. However, what's interesting with regards to your question about the development of the continent, if you look at East Asia, which everyone has its eyes on, it's all the rage, all the talk because of the accelerated growth and the opportunities that are coming with that part of the world. Japan, for instance, is a highly developed country. It underwent its own industrialized journey in the late 1800s and grew to a superpower status by the time the 1940s came around, where obviously you had World War II. After the war, you had the rise of what we call the Asian Tigers, where South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore underwent mass development and industrialization, developed very strong institutions, became very big investment hubs. Taiwan had the semiconductor industry, for instance. A lot of big companies we know today, such as Kia and Samsung, came out of South Korea. And they are, fully developed countries now. Very good standard of living, very big investment hubs. And you're also starting to see now, in maybe the last 2 decades, like not only the rise of China, which is a big, big thing, but also other countries such as Indonesia and Vietnam, Malaysia, now also developing at an accelerated rate. Now, when you look at Africa, I'd say what's quite interesting is that I usually think of Africa mainly being sub-Saharan Africa, because North Africa, I think, has more association mainly with the Mediterranean and the Middle East because of its various history. Mm-hmm. And also because the Sahara Desert, in my mind, is essentially an ocean of sand. Mm-hmm. And throughout its history, sub-Saharan Africa has been a little bit cut off from a lot of the exchange of culture and technology, and the various radical events that happened in Europe and Asia and the Middle East because of that geographical barrier, which I think has an influence in many ways. I mean, if you look at night at the continent, you'll see a lot of lights around the cities of sub-Saharan Africa, and the border of North Africa where the Mediterranean is, you see this little trickle of lights where all its cities are built essentially on the Mediterranean coast. And in this sheer darkness where the desert is, because there is no connection between, sub-Saharan Africa, where you move out of the desert, and the very tip of North Africa, where populations of, say, Libya and Egypt and Morocco are. And it's very hard to build infrastructure, create any sort of exchange of communication ideas and culture. And so there is this talk about, well, Africa is, going to have a very large portion of the world population over the next 50 years. As developed countries in East Asia, China, Europe, and North America start to experience an aging population due to low birth rates. Africa will continue to grow in its population, and therefore a lot of the world's youth are going to be on the continent. Now that provides huge opportunities and also some risks with it. I mean, there's this opportunity for Africa to be the workforce of the future, and with young people comes new ideas and entrepreneurial ventures and like innovative technologies. But if the continent is unable to provide opportunity and education and all the other various things to help young people succeed, then it'll be a really unfortunate and sad result for the world. So there is a lot of eyes on the continent, a lot of hope and prospects that it will develop in the same way that we've seen East Asia develop. And so there's this question of, you had the Asian tigers in East Asia. Are you going to have what they call the African lions? And there are some countries that are starting to stand out. I mean, I think the biggest flaw that people can have is assume that the continent is one thing. It's not one country. There are over 1 billion people. It's the most multi-ethnic part of the world. South Africa, as I mentioned, already has 11 languages. So it's many nations mixed into one, you could say. And I think that every country is on its own journey of development. And I think you are seeing countries like Rwanda, Ghana, and Kenya really rising and experiencing positive growth and developing good institutions. And I think that we will see over time that some will probably do really well, where maybe their neighbors don't. I think ultimately we want the whole nation to be stable and rise up together, but I think things happen in different phases because every country is going through a different journey. And I think it's a big question for South Africa as well, being this diversified country in its economy and, highly industrialized. Like, is South Africa going to be part of that growth and part of that journey as well? There's a lot of issues that South Africa has to resolve. But, I think we'll see what is to come.
I've read that extreme poverty has reduced from where it was, 30 years ago. It was in pretty extreme numbers. It was representing quite a large proportion of Africa. Now it's gone down to numbers that can be handled, within a decade or two, where it can potentially even be eradicated, as many other countries have done so around the world. However, with that in mind, do you think the few countries that you spoke about, for example, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, maybe the countries in East Africa around Kenya, do you think they're potentially held back by being part of a continent that is still trying to eradicate poverty, whereas those countries are, looking at how to make that leap from where they were 30 years ago to, potentially competing against these tiger countries? So do you think that doesn't help these countries? Is there an advantage or disadvantage that you see from that?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think institutions matter. The developing of good institutions that are very inclusive is extremely important. I think a lot of countries are sort of in the very early days of their democratic journey as well, which poses various challenges. But I think you want stable regions ultimately, and I think that geography can be a barrier as well, not just institutions. And I'd say that if we look at the EU, for instance, the way it's developed since the end of World War II has really been quite remarkable. I mean, it's been the biggest time of peace in Europe's history, the last 80 years. And that unity and that lowering of tariffs and regulations and that very strong system of trade has really benefited Europe.
But hasn't it been only a bunch of countries that have benefited the most? So some would argue that, Germany and France still maintain the most powerful position in the EU. They are potentially better off than the other countries that, need to be bailed out on a regular basis or due to recessions that do happen on a regular basis. So wouldn't you say power and prosperity has been concentrated in those powerhouse countries? And I'm trying to think, will that not end up happening in Africa as well?
That's a very tough answer to give there. I think that most of Africa is still, because it's still in a developing state, most of its economy is based on exports of minerals. And I think that there has actually been a new African trade agreement, which is about lowering tariffs trade between African countries, which is a very good start to seeing how trade can be facilitated between other countries in Africa, and development of like cross-continental infrastructure. And that will help, I think, in like boosting the continent as a whole. I think personally, most of the European nations have really benefited from being part of the EU, and it is going to be hard to see how the African continent deals with that. I mean, you're seeing in East Asia a lot of really strong trade agreements like ASEAN, where nations are having a much stronger flow of goods and people and investment across their borders, which is helping the whole region to rise, you know.
Yeah, but isn't the difference the fact that, East, West, and South of Africa, these powerhouses of Africa of development, are separated by massive forests and countries that don't have the infrastructure that they need to conduct proper trade that is possible in Europe or Southeast Asia. So doesn't that mean, if we take one example if we look at Nigeria as an example, why would Nigeria prefer to trade with South Africa or East Africa rather than the countries that it can ship directly to using its ports?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because you're right. You have, like, for instance, the Congo, which is a very dense rainforest and very unpenetrable, and there are these limits. I think Southeast Asia is very well connected to the ocean and to water, and throughout its history has been a large trading hub. We know that before the Industrial Revolution, China and India were these like major superpowers of trade and economic activity. And I think, partially their access to the ocean, the ability to trade other countries has been to its benefit. I mean, you take South Africa, for instance, the Cape, where Cape Town is, that was probably the most strategic part of the British Empire and the world for trade between East and West. I mean, you didn't have the Suez Canal, so to trade with the East, you had to go circumnavigate the whole continent, and Cape Town was the stopover. It was a very strategic position. It also was very attractive for development and for settlement, because it's one of the very few malaria-free parts of the continent.
Okay, I didn't know
So
that.
people could settle in South Africa very easily, engage in agriculture. It has various different climatic conditions to make it conducive for humans to live. And so that was very attractive, and I think it's why it became a nation of many different people in many ways. I think that what's interesting is when the Suez Canal was built, it almost made the Cape irrelevant, because now you had a much shorter way to engage in trade. However, diamonds and gold, the biggest gold deposit in the world, was discovered in the interior of South Africa, which is the Transvaal region. And that led also to an influx of interest and development, because now the economy of South Africa was really based on mining. And you had huge migrant population going to work in the mines. I mean, you had platinum, you had coal, you had gold, diamonds. It still, to this day, has a large mining sector as a result. And that kind of kept South Africa relevant and going for a long time. And I think that you don't want to be dependent purely on your geography or your natural resources. You want to develop into being a nation that has more tertiary services and value to add to the world in terms of your technological development, your industrial capacity, all of that. I think that's always going to be really important in the story of a country's journey. I mean, Singapore is a great example of a country without natural resources, but it's been, it took 50 years to fully develop that country, because it just became very attractive for investment, invested heavily in education, and became a really big hub for manufacturing as well. And over time has transitioned into this big hub for tertiary services such as financial services and technology,
Yeah, but talking about natural resources, South Africa isn't unique in the fact that it has rich natural resources and is in Africa. There are many other countries in Africa that have, natural resources that the rest of the world desires. One of the reasons for so many countries having interest in Africa. Why is it that South Africa has been able to develop so fast using those natural resources But when you compare South Africa to a lot of other African nations, even post-colonization, why haven't those countries been able to leverage their natural resource?
Yeah, good points. I mean, you've got the DRC, for instance, which is a very large country in the Congo, and it has probably one of the most mineral-rich countries in the world. But I think that can often be to your disadvantage. I think it already comes down to the small incidents and events that take place in your history to develop your institutions, as I mentioned, that allow you to really industrialize in that capacity and to generate that wealth, but also how it's distributed among the nation. The DRC is a good example. I think there's a word for it called like the Dutch disease, where you become too dependent on a certain resource and ultimately you fail to develop beyond that. And I think that is sometimes the problem for a lot of developing countries. They become too dependent on one resource that ultimately enriches a few and doesn't really distribute well to the rest of the country. I think you start to see in the Middle Eastern countries like the UAE and many others, where of course they're very oil-rich countries, but they probably are quite aware of the challenge that poses to them, in that if the oil price drops or it'll run dry or the world transitions to something new, they are going to be in a tight position. And so I think generating wealth through those commodities is important, but they need to be directly reinvested into developing other industries as well.
Yeah. And where do you think the largest opportunity lies for the next 50 to 100 years with South Africa, but also broadly in Africa? Where do you think the most improvements can be brought about now that we're moving out of this age of poverty and malaria needs to be eradicated before anything else? Post that, well, what next?
Well, I think what's quite interesting is that developing countries have proven the ability to what we call leapfrog through technologies. So they can jump from, railways to airport freight much faster. They can leapfrog fixed line technologies to wireless technologies, and from dirty fossil fuels to renewable energy. They don't have all that necessarily that legacy infrastructure to worry about, so they can leapfrog. And I think there's a huge opportunity there. I think that the potential in the energy sector in Africa is very large, due to, the large abundance of sun we have. I think that various things like digital banking, I think various communications with the world's working more remotely, and you can work and study online. You can get an MIT or Harvard degree by doing it in the middle of nowhere. I think that these kinds of opportunities will really help countries leapfrog and not have to go through the exact same process other ones have gone through previously. And I think that that's really why I felt very strongly about the work that we were doing, in that if you're going to give people access to e-learning technologies that are now being empowered by AI to just improve the learning experience and make it more adaptive to the individual, if we're going to give people like financial services in remote locations, if we're going to provide them with energy and electricity access, you need to have the underlying infrastructure in order to use those services and have the benefit of those products. And I think that is like a huge driver at the moment. You can see our prosperity and growth can happen much faster now because of these technologies, but we need to be able to provide them first.
Yeah. And you would think that going from 0 to 1 in terms of not having fiber broadband and suddenly having it, in terms of society, that would be quite a celebrated event. How was it in terms of a business being involved in that? Was that something that people were looking forward to? Inviting your business over? When can you come and install our fiber broadband? Or do you have any challenges?
I think when people start learning about the benefits of fiber connectivity, especially at the price points, we offering prepaid services, something that's really like customized for, say, how the market wanted it to be. And people were desperate for it. Hey? People really wanted fiber connectivity because, if you could just consider the pandemic, we saw a huge spark in people who maybe were delaying and then chose to get connected, because the whole world had to all of a sudden start working from home, and kids started to having to do their learning and studies from home. And so people really start to see the benefits and just the need of that high-speed internet connectivity, and that fiber could provide it. And so we really were able to, we were considered an essential service. We were able to keep going during the lockdown period to keep connecting people because of just how important it was. And so I think it's been a really positive thing for the country. And I can't imagine if we had the pandemic 6 or 7 years ago, how the whole world would have managed without internet access, you know? Yeah.